Hands up! Hands up! No! Don't!
When you start a war, what matters is not being right, but winning. Those words were spoken by Adolf Hitler on August 22, 1939, at a meeting with his military chiefs. 10 days later, the German invasion of Poland marked the beginning of the largest conflict in history. The Führer was determined to pursue his dream of creating a new empire. He knew that to do so, he would have to crush numerous rivals. In his eyes, these were inferior to the Nazis, but time changed his perceptions. As the battle progressed, the Germans encountered three very particular enemies who were willing to stop the brutal conquest of the Third Reich. In this new military history video, we will discover what the Nazis thought about Soviet, British, and American soldiers, and how these perceptions influenced the development of the clashes, as well as the actions the Germans took to confront any voice that opposed Hitler. Join us to discover new secrets of World War II. The dense European climate foretold news of war. On September 1, 1939, Adolf Hitler's German troops entered Polish territory and laid waste to everything. But they did not stop there. In the first months of 1940, the invasion spread to Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and finally to a great power, France. All nations fell victim to Nazism. The Third Reich had given a clear demonstration of its power, and with high confidence it continued with its plans of conquest. However, they began to encounter unexpected resistance from rivals they believed to be inferior. And at the top of that list are the Soviet soldiers. The Red Army was one of the most emblematic rivals of the Germans for different reasons. In principle, the relationship between both countries during the war period had ups and downs, although always with great tension in between. Before the conflict broke out, the nations had signed a non-aggression pact with each other, which also concealed a dark secret. Although it was not written in the agreement, Hitler and Stalin had defined how they would divide Poland when the war began. This made them allies. Despite this, the Nazi leader was openly against the communist regime of this temporary partner. After the great conquests of his men, Hitler decided to betray Stalin, launching the so-called Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, which consisted of invading Soviet territory. From there, another story began. The German people fervently supported the decisions of their leader, which generated great optimism of achieving victory and aroused enormous contempt for the soldiers of this new enemy. At the beginning of the operation, the Nazi fighters greatly underestimated the Soviets. This was influenced by the propaganda of the Third Reich, which presented the members of the Red Army as subhumans. This was a racist term used by the Germans to refer to peoples they considered inferior, such as Slavs and Jews. This negative image was designed to justify atrocities committed on the Eastern Front, including brutality towards prisoners of war and civilians from the Soviet Union.
К советским солдатам у немцев было особенное отношение. Сначала они смотрели на них крайне негативно, через призму навязанной пропагандой еврейско-большевистской угрозы. Советские солдаты изображались как нищие варвары, которые хотят на своих штыках принести в Европу дикие большевистские порядки.
The Soviet Union was seen as a chaotic state that would quickly collapse in the face of a German invasion. Poorly organized and ill-equipped, they were motivated only by fear of repression. Blitzkrieg had been successful on other fronts, and the first advances in this territory during Operation Barbarossa seemed to confirm the belief that Stalin's fall was imminent. They had even managed to capture large numbers of Red Army warriors. However, towards the end of 1941, this view began to change. The arrival of the Russian winter, together with the ability of its warriors to continue resisting and launch counterattacks on the outskirts of Moscow, surprised many German soldiers. Beyond suffering huge losses, the tenacious defense of Stalin's men prevented the country from collapsing as expected. Although Hitler's forces had advanced quickly, they underestimated both the skill of their rivals and the harshness of the winter conditions. All this together demonstrated to the Nazis that the Soviets were not an easy enemy to defeat. Amid the brutal battle, signs of respect began to emerge among German soldiers for the Russian ability to withstand the toughest challenges and its skill to bounce back after major blows.
The Russians continued to fight in the most hopeless situations. Surprise and respect for German officers were also caused by the physical and spiritual stamina of Soviet soldiers, their unpretentiousness, ability to survive in incredibly difficult conditions, and also courageously endure hardships and suffering. The Germans also admired the Soviet soldiers' ability to work, their speed, and their skill in which they built complex fortifications and underground tunnels.
Operation Barbarossa ended in December 1941 due to the Soviets' incredible resistance. However, the retreating Germans were already preparing for the next blow. The Battle of Stalingrad, which saw its first major clashes inside the city on 23 August 1942, marked a turning point both militarily and psychologically. In this engagement, the Soviets again demonstrated fierce resistance and managed to encircle and defeat the German Sixth Army, which represented one of the biggest setbacks for the Third Reich. The brutality of the Russian defense challenged the Nazis' initial perceptions. German soldiers who participated in the fighting and survived described the Red Army men as incredibly tough fighters, willing to do anything to defend their land. From that point on, Nazi propaganda had to adjust its narrative, implicitly acknowledging the strength of the Soviets, while still insisting that they were led by a tyrannical and cruel regime. In the final stages of the war, many German soldiers knew they were fighting an enemy that was not only militarily capable, but also filled with a deep desire for revenge for the destruction of their homeland. The Russian advance on Berlin was savage. Stalin's warriors were relentless, and the enormous sacrifice paid off. They eventually conquered the capital of the Third Reich. The Soviets had certainly been the exception to the rule in Europe, proving that not all countries would fall under Adolf Hitler's sweeping power.
The Germans were interested in the difference in tactics against Allied forces on the Western Front and the USSR. Against Europeans, quickly seized the initiative in an unexpected encounter and forced the enemy to surrender. It worked almost 100% of the time for the Germans. It didn't work only with Soviet soldiers. They fought back, even when the chances of success were minimal.
Now, after learning about the surprising Soviet resilience, it is time to move on to the Second Army, and here we find a very different opinion of the Germans, both in terms of propaganda and combat experiences. We are talking about the forces of Great Britain. The Germans, especially the officers and soldiers, had a deep respect for the British military tradition. With their long history in international conflicts and their reputation for discipline and professionalism, they were seen as a respectable and worthy enemy. It was openly acknowledged that facing the British would be fighting against a well-trained and highly experienced force. During the First World War, both armies had had intense clashes, and that memory also influenced the German perception of the British. There was a kind of honorable rivalry between the powers, and Hitler's warriors considered them more similar to them in terms of organization and approach to the fight. However, the opinion of the Third Reich also included a harsh criticism of the High Command, finding a deficiency in the tactics in the field.
The Germans gave British soldiers the nickname "lions led by donkeys." The Germans regarded the British military as professional, disciplined, well-trained, brave, and tenacious. But the British were uninitiated compared to the Germans. Their tactical understanding was at zero. They didn't know how to adapt to circumstances.
Despite this aspect that allowed the Nazis to feel superior, respect for the British was never lost. On the contrary, it was reinforced after the Battle of Britain, fought between July 10th and October 31st, 1940. The Germans, who expected a quick aerial victory that would lead to a possible invasion of the islands, encountered unexpected resistance from their opponent. Despite the overwhelming numerical superiority of the Nazi fleet, their rivals managed to resist the intense bombings, which generated a mixture of admiration and frustration among the Führer's men. The ability of the British to defend themselves in the skies, their effective use of radars, and the organization of their air defense impressed everyone in Berlin. Even Hitler himself felt a renewed respect for Britain's forces after the failed operation, although he underestimated their ability to stay in the war in the long term. On the other hand, the little-known front in North Africa also influenced the German perception of the English. In this theater of operations, the Afrika Korps of the renowned Nazi general Erwin Rommel fought mainly against the British Eighth Army, developing a mutual admiration between soldiers of both sides. Rommel was highly respected by the British fighters, and the Germans did the same for the tenacity of the enemy in the desert fight. Unlike on the Eastern Front, where hostilities with the Soviets were extremely brutal, in North Africa there were episodes of more chivalrous treatment between the sides. Truces to rescue the wounded were often respected, and in general the Nazi perception of the British was that of disciplined soldiers with a strong sense of military honor. Beyond all this, the fighting was still bloody and savage. These are the US troops who played a crucial role in the fate of World War II and whose perception from the German point of view was very different from that of the Soviets and the British. To begin with, before the US entered the war as a result of the Japanese attack on the naval base at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the Nazis did not consider Washington to be a serious threat. The regime's propaganda portrayed Americans as a materialistic people, focused on consumerism and technology, without the same military tradition and discipline as Europeans. They were seen as inexperienced soldiers who would enter the war without adequate preparation, which generated a perception of inferiority with respect to the armies of the old continent. In addition, the Germans were confident that the American people would not have the will to sustain a prolonged battle due to their geographical isolation. And as if that were not enough, Hitler himself expressed doubts about the United States' ability to maintain a fight on two fronts against Germany and Japan. Despite initial speculation, Washington soldiers entered the war, and the first important interaction against the Nazis occurred in North Africa in 1942. As with the British, Rommel's forces faced the enemy, and in this case they obtained significant victories against the American troops.
The Germans had a very definite and unanimous impression of the Americans. All those who fought with them on the Western Front speak of the US Army as mediocre soldiers, who didn't have sufficient stamina and determination. The Americans achieved victories only thanks to an unlimited amount of resources, military equipment, weapons, and ammunition.
The Nazis compared the Americans unfavorably to the British, who had more experience on the battlefield. However, this event also motivated American soldiers to make important changes in their leadership, tactics, and logistics, which significantly improved their combat performance. The major operation that clearly shows the progress of American forces was the Normandy Landings of June 6, 1944, when the Allies carried out the largest amphibious invasion in history. Although the Nazis managed to inflict heavy losses during the first stage of the mission, American forces demonstrated great skill in prevailing on the beaches and then rapidly expanding into the interior of France. This surprised the Germans and marked a breaking point for the Third Reich, whose dominance began to be seriously compromised. In fact, the numerical and material superiority of the Americans allowed them to make great strides towards the liberation of France. This dealt a devastating blow to Hitler's troops, who were in a difficult situation. However, the Führer's men continued to feel that they were superior to their enemy.
In Germany in 1944 to 1945, there was an acute shortage of resources. The Americans fought aggressively, but they were tactically clumsy. Their tactics were primitive. They sent troops forward, besieging the enemy with excessive fire. The soldiers didn't show special zeal and heroism. They did their job and tried to survive the war. The Germans were very fond of making ambushes against the Americans. It was perfect against their aggressive, straightforward tactics.
Despite being vulnerable to certain German strategies, the Americans did not stop advancing. Soon their logistical efficiency, supply efficiency, and ability to mobilize troops and equipment quickly became one of the keys to the war. The same happened with their air and naval dominance, something that impressed the Nazi forces. The mass production of tanks, planes, and weapons, as well as their ability to continue fighting without interruptions, became a point of respect for the Americans. The Battle of the Bulge, which began on December 16, 1944, was the last offensive launched by German troops in the hope of dividing the Allied forces and negotiating a favorable peace agreement for their country. However, it was a failure. The combat only served to allow Nazi soldiers to observe firsthand the tenacity of the Americans in the field. Despite the harsh winter conditions and ambushes by the Third Reich, the Americans managed to resist and eventually counterattack. Here again, America's industrial capacity had a great impact, allowing it to have an inexhaustible flow of equipment and supplies to sustain prolonged operations. Towards the end of the war, the Germans began to see the Americans as the main military power among the Western Allies. Their ability to take the battle to Europe and then advance on Berlin was a clear sign of their power. As with the British, many defeated Nazi soldiers preferred to surrender to American forces rather than fight with the Soviets, who were thirsty for revenge for the brutality of the Eastern Front. The example of these three armies shows how the Nazis radically changed their opinion of the enemies they faced. Their excessive confidence and the way in which they underestimated their rivals were an important part of the collapse of a regime that was convinced it would dominate the world. July 13, 1942. A unit of 500 German soldiers, the 101st Police Reserve Battalion, arrives in the town of Josov, located in east-central Poland, with the mission of eradicating the Jews living there. These are 1,500 people who, by express orders from the leaders of the Third Reich, must be eliminated immediately. They should not show mercy to anyone, not even women, children, or the elderly. However, there is a catch. None of these men have killed anyone before. For them, taking a life is something new. The troop commander, Major Wilhelm Trapp, knows that the Germans are inexperienced, so he offers them the opportunity not to participate in the massacre. He meets with them and tells them that, if they do not want to become murderers, all they have to do is take a step forward, and they will be exempt from this aberrant task. What happened next is one of the most surprising events of World War II and relates to the Germans' motives for killing. Did they do it for pleasure, or on the contrary because they felt they had no alternative? Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you what the Nazis felt when annihilating their enemies. To understand this history, we have to go back to the origins of Nazi hatred. The National Socialist Party had the firm conviction that the human species was divided into races. According to this theory, each of them had particular characteristics that had been transmitted hereditarily for thousands of years. This meant that they had a distinctive physical appearance, but also a certain culture, way of thinking, and intelligence. On the other hand, not all races were equal to each other, but rather they were organized between the inferior and the superior. This scientific theory established that some possessed genetic attributes that made them suitable to lead humanity, while the rest were destined to submit. Nazism also adopted the idea of survival of the fittest, meaning that, in order not to perish, a race had to multiply and accumulate land to support that growing population. As physical space was somewhat limited, to acquire new territories, it was necessary to destroy the inferior peoples. Of course, the Führer's followers thought that the Germans were the Aryan race that should conquer Europe. Let's see David Silberklang, a specialist in this matter, explain this to us.
At its core, the Nazi worldview was racist and biological, positing that the so-called Aryan race, primarily the North Europeans, was the superior race of human beings to which nearly all positive human development in science, technology, art, architecture, and other fields could be attributed.
Among those who were to be exterminated were Jews, people of African descent, and Slavs. It is not known with certainty how Hitler embraced these theories of hatred or the reasons for his intense anti-Semitism. There are those who claim that the Nazi leader had a venereal disease that had been contracted by a Jewish prostitute. Others maintain that he was ashamed of having a distant Semitic ancestor. None of this is verifiable, but what we do know is that the social and political context of the 1920s was perfect for the darkest feelings of the German population to emerge. The Germans were defeated in World War I, and at the end of the war, a good part of the country embraced the stab in the back theory. According to her, the culprits of the war's failure had been the Jews, who conspired to make the nation surrender just when it was about to triumph. Hitler was one of the many who accepted these postulates as valid, and from then on, he began an impressive political career that catapulted him to the top of the German government. Once he was in command of the Third Reich, he dedicated himself to implementing its perverse racial policy. For the Führer, it was necessary to maintain the purity of the Aryans, which meant that the Germans did not have to mix with members of the inferior races. The only way to strengthen the people was to preserve their blood clean and free of deficient genes. To achieve this, blacks, Jews, and Slavs were progressively separated from the rest of society to the point where they were isolated in concentration camps. During World War II, the Nazis launched their extermination plans and dedicated themselves to annihilating all those people they saw as subhuman. The descriptions of the massacres are chilling and show the bloodlust that Germany's troops harbored. Take the example of the Babi Yar massacre, which occurred between September 29 and 30, 1941. This episode occurred when the German occupation forces in Ukraine decided to get rid of the Jews from the country's capital. To do this, they were summoned by the following statement: all Jews living in the city of Kiev and its surroundings must appear at 8 in the morning at the corner of Melnikovskaya and Doktorov streets near the cemetery. They must carry with them their documents, money, valuables, as well as warm clothing, bedding, etc. Any Jew who does not comply with this instruction and is found elsewhere will be executed. Citizens who enter the abandoned apartments of the Semites and seize their property will be shot. They were strict words that left no room for any alternative. One had to obey or die. The day after the publication of the message, some 30,000 Jewish men, women, and children showed up at the indicated place, thinking that they would be deported to some distant concentration camp. They were not aware that they were terribly wrong and that the worst of fates awaited them. The Germans took them on foot to the Babi Yar ravine, located on the outskirts of the city, where they made them strip naked and lie face down. While they were lying down, the soldiers drew their pistols and machine guns and began shooting at them at point-blank range. The victims who arrived last at the site were forced to lie on top of the corpses to save space and were murdered just as coldly. Let's see a survivor of the day tell us what she remembers.
Первым упал папа, а я видела, как папа упал и потянул маму с собой. Потом сестры, а потом я уже не помню. Я не помню, я только пришла в себя тогда, когда была ночь, и было холодно очень. И я от холода пришла в себя, на мне была тяжесть большая. Я вернуться не могла, тяжесть трупа на мне лежала.
Another witness to the massacre remembers it in the following way. Plunged she could not flee. The blows were brutal. Blood flowed immediately from the heads, backs, and shoulders to the left and to the right. There was no escape. The soldiers shouted, "Quick, quick," and laughed with amusement as if they were watching a circus show. They had even found a way to hit harder in the most vulnerable places, the ribs, stomach, and groin. It is estimated that almost all the Jews who attended the meeting were executed during that day, making it one of the bloodiest during the occupation of Ukraine. When analyzing the statements and testimonies about this carnage, one of the most notable points is how much fun the Nazis felt when killing their enemies. When faced with the suffering of others, his reaction was not to pity or cry, but to celebrate, make jokes, and laugh. In general, all the massacres in which members of the National Socialist Party participated developed in a similar way to this one. The behavior of the Germans can be explained first of all by the success that the racist ideology of the Third Reich had had. In any corner of the Nazi Empire, the regime's official propaganda could be found, which promoted hatred towards inferior peoples. After years of installing in society that these people were dangerous for the Aryan race, a good part of the Germans ended up accepting it as an unquestionable truth. They were convinced that they were superior, that they were called to dominate the planet, and that others should be, at best, their servants. Therefore, it is possible that by murdering a supposedly inferior person, whose life was worth the same as that of an insect, they felt the pleasure of doing the world a favor. It is known that the Nazis accompanied mass murders with relaxing music, in order to liven up the moment and make it more satisfying. In the Auschwitz extermination center, it was common for SS guards to enter the barracks where the prisoners lived drunk and without prior notice during the night. They harassed the inmates and asked those who had knowledge of music to play an instrument. If the inmates refused, they were savagely beaten or, worse still, shot on the spot. While some happy melody was playing, the Germans began to rape the youngest women in the barracks. Something equally macabre was happening in the Belzec concentration camp. The Nazis organized an orchestra made up of prisoners to play while they murdered people in the gas chambers. The cries of the victims were drowned out by the notes sung by the violins, guitars, double basses, and cellos. Sometimes music was used during massacres, as happened on November 3, 1943, when 18,000 Jews were executed at the Majdanek extermination center. That dark day began at 5 in the morning. When the inmates were taken to a trench on the outskirts of the site, they were made to go down into some wells in groups of 10 and shot in the back of the head. The process continued until the afternoon, when the ground was covered by a mountain of corpses. As the air was filled with the sound of gunshots and the screams of the dying, the soldiers turned on the truck's speakers and played music. Thus, the massacre was harmonized with waltzes, tangos, military marches, and German folk songs. These examples are enough to affirm that there were Nazis who genuinely enjoyed their task and who couldn't wait to open fire on defenseless prisoners. Hitler's racist preaching had turned them into soulless monsters who blindly obeyed the commands of the hierarchs of the Third Reich. However, although sadism was quite widespread among the troops, it is not true that all Germans behaved in this way. There were those who killed, but they did not do it with pleasure. They hated the mission they had been given and were ashamed of themselves. Others, on the other hand, brandished their rifles indifferently and shot at their enemies without giving it much thought. They did not hate the inferior races, but they believed that they had to follow the orders of their superiors without question. So they killed without enthusiasm, but not with regret either. In this sense, let's look at one of the most striking cases of the Holocaust, that of the 101st Police Reserve Battalion. This unit was made up of men between 30 and 50 years old, people too old to be recruited as regular soldiers of the Wehrmacht. All of them were assigned to this group, which was used as second-line troops in the territories occupied by the Third Reich. They carried out deportation missions for non-Aryans. This involved evicting them from their homes and directing them to a train that would take them to a concentration camp. The battalion was made up of about 500 soldiers from Hamburg, a city where communism was strong and where the Nazis often lost elections, when Hitler's dictatorship had not yet begun. Let's listen to historian Christopher Browning tell us about the members of the unit.
They were mostly working class, which meant this was the class that in greater proportions voted for the communists and the socialists. The Nazis had less success in winning over working class people than other classes in society.
This meant that the members of the 101st were probably not convinced Nazis, but were there out of obligation. Even so, as we will see below, they did not hesitate when it came to committing a terrible crime. As we told you at the beginning of this video, on July 13, 1942, Battalion 101 was sent to eliminate 1,500 Jews in the town of Josov in Poland. They had never killed anyone before. This would be their baptism of blood. The unit's commander, Major Wilhelm Trapp, offered his men the chance to stay out of the slaughter. All they had to do was take one step forward, and they would be excluded from the mission without punishment. The response of the troops was surprising. Of 500 soldiers, only 12 refused to be part of the massacre and the rest took up their weapons. They took the victims to a forest and separated them into groups. The Jews were shot in the back of the head, as was common in this type of execution. It was done this way because it was the simplest way and the one that finished people off immediately. With this totally dehumanized look, the fact of not wasting bullets was considered a triumph. The Germans followed the orders to the letter and ended up bathed in blood and splattered with pieces of bone and remains of gray matter. It was such a macabre scene that some asked to leave to take a break, drink alcohol, gather their strength, and then return to the massacre. By the end of the day, the Jewish population of Josefov had been exterminated. At the end of World War II, almost none of the battalion's members were convicted of their crimes. Only Major Wilhelm Trapp and 2 other junior officers were captured by the Allies and tried for war crimes. The court found them guilty and, in December 1948, sentenced them to death by hanging. Decades later, the surviving members of the battalion were interviewed by historian Christopher Browning, whom we heard from earlier. The former soldiers claimed they did not enjoy any of the killings. There were those who were ashamed of their actions. Others, however, justified themselves by saying that they were doing their job. When asked why they did not reject their commander's offer and refuse to be part of the massacre, they responded that they were simply afraid of being called cowards by their comrades. This means that, according to them, they did not kill out of anti-Semitism, nor out of loyalty to the Führer, but because they did not want others to think they were weak. Let us turn again to Professor Browning, who explains this in great detail.
And the pressures that are exerted in a small group, particularly an occupation unit in foreign territory, hostile territory in war, where they have no other support network, where peer pressure, role adaptation, deference to authority, all of these factors we know from other kinds of social psychological experiments shape people's behavior in groups in ways that they will do things they would never do as individuals.
In short, do the Nazis enjoy massacring their enemies, or did they do it because they had no alternative? We will never know. But as we have seen in this video, the Germans reacted in various ways to orders to eliminate their enemies, some with a smile on their lips, others with a mixture of rejection and shame. The truth is that most of the perpetrators of the Holocaust were not punished, leaving victims feeling that the injustice will never end. We reached the end of the video and we want to ask you, do you think the Nazis felt pleasure in killing their victims? Leave us your answer in the comments box below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.